The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across 12 empty chairs, while Madame Delphine Lalaurie set the 13th place setting with trembling hands. Steam rose from the bone china teacups, carrying the bitter scent of chicory coffee and something else that made the parlor air thick as graveyard fog, while the grandfather clock in the corner counted down to 8 o'clock with the steady rhythm of a funeral march. This is the story of how New Orleans society discovered that some dinner invitations come with a price higher than death itself. Before we descend into the shadows of 1903 Louisiana, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in police files for over a century. The Garden District Mansion at 2140 Royal Street had belonged to the Lalaurie family for 3 generations. Wrought iron balconies twisted like skeletal fingers around the 3-story facade, while Spanish moss draped the ancient oaks like mourning veils. Inside, Delphine moved through rooms that echoed with more than just her footsteps. She had become a widow 6 months earlier when her husband Armand died, under circumstances the coroner diplomatically termed sudden cardiac failure. The death certificate made no mention of the peculiar blue tinge to his lips, or the way his fingernails had turned black as if dipped in ink. Delphine had wept appropriately at the funeral, dabbing her eyes with lace handkerchiefs, while neighbors whispered about how devoted she had been to her ailing husband. The whispers grew louder when she began hosting dinner parties again just 3 weeks after the burial. Every Tuesday evening at precisely 8 o'clock, Delphine would set her dining table for 13 guests. 12 living souls from New Orleans high society would arrive in their finest carriages, stepping carefully around the puddles that seemed to perpetually form near the front steps, despite the lack of rain. The 13th chair remained empty, save for the place setting Delphine insisted on arranging with obsessive precision. "For my dear departed Armand," she would explain to puzzled guests, her voice carrying the musical cadence of old Creole aristocracy. "He so enjoyed our gatherings. I cannot bear to exclude him simply because he has relocated to another realm." The guests found her eccentricity charming at first. Grief, they understood, manifested in strange ways among the wealthy. But charm curdled into unease as October nights grew colder and Delphine's dinner parties grew stranger. Judge Beauregard Trem, a frequent guest, later told police investigators that the conversations at these gatherings felt guided by an invisible hand. Topics would shift without warning from mundane social gossip to intimate confessions that left speakers horrified by their own words. Mrs. Evangeline Broussard, wife of a prominent banker, once found herself describing in vivid detail how she had poisoned her first husband's medication 20 years earlier, a secret she claimed she had never spoken aloud before. Death hung over the dining table like incense. From Detective Inspector Claude Dubois' case notes, dated November 15, 1903, witnesses report subjects appeared compelled to speak against their will. Madame Lalaurie observed their confessions with keen interest, taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal she kept beside her plate. The journal disappeared the night Delphine vanished, but not before several guests glimpsed its contents. Pages filled with secrets, sins, and what appeared to be a meticulous catalogue of human weaknesses. Mrs. Broussard described seeing her own name written in Delphine's elegant script, followed by the words, "Mercury in morning tea, gradual decline preferred." As autumn deepened into winter, the dinner invitations became impossible to refuse. Guests would arrive at their mansions to find Delphine's calling cards, waiting on silver trays, written in that familiar flowing hand. Your presence is required at dinner. 8 o'clock. Wear something you can be buried in. Those who attempted to decline found themselves compelled to attend anyway. Dr. Henri Marigny, a respected physician, swore he had burned his invitation and locked himself in his study, only to discover himself standing on Delphine's doorstep at 8 o'clock with no memory of the journey. His wife found his study empty, the door still locked from the inside, with only the acrid smell of burnt paper lingering in the air. But what force could reach through locked doors and drag men from their homes? What power did Delphine wield that made New Orleans elite dance to her macabre orchestrations? And why did each dinner party leave its attendees looking paler, more hollow, as if something vital had been drained from their very souls? The answers lay in the 13th chair, and the guest who always arrived precisely at midnight, long after the living had fled into the night with their darkest secrets exposed for all to hear. The wrought iron gate swung open without a sound as the clock tower chimed 12 times across the silent garden district. Fog rolled off the Mississippi River like spilled milk, pooling in the cobblestone streets while the scent of jasmine and decay mingled in the October air, thick enough to taste on the back of your tongue. By midnight, the living guests had always fled, leaving only Delphine to welcome her most important visitor. Mrs. Celeste Thibodeau, who lived in the mansion directly across Royal Street, kept detailed records of what she witnessed from her bedroom window during those autumn nights of 1903. Her diary, discovered after her own mysterious death 6 months later, provides the only reliable account of Delphine's midnight rituals. October 23, 1903. The fog cleared just long enough for me to see him ascending the front steps. Tall, elegant, wearing a coat that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it. No footprints marked the wet pavement behind him. When he reached the door, Delphine was already waiting with a smile that could freeze blood. The man who called himself Monsieur Morte had appeared at Delphine's first dinner party claiming to be an old family friend from Paris. He spoke French with an accent that predated the Revolution, used terms of address that had fallen from fashion before Napoleon's time, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of scandals spanning 3 centuries of New Orleans history. More disturbing was his effect on the other guests. Within minutes of his arrival, tongues loosened like wine from broken bottles. Confessions poured forth unbidden. Embezzled funds, poisoned spouses, children sold into slavery despite legal emancipation, affairs that had destroyed entire bloodlines. Secrets buried so deep their owners had forgotten them surfaced like corpses after a flood. Judge Treem later described the sensation to police investigators. I found myself speaking words I had no intention of saying. It was as if my mouth belonged to someone else, operated by invisible strings. I confessed to taking bribes from the railroad company, to falsifying documents that sent innocent men to Angola prison, to things I swore I would carry to my grave. But Monsieur Morte never spoke of his own past. He simply listened with the patience of stone, occasionally nodding or asking pointed questions that drew forth even more damaging admissions. And always, Delphine sat beside him, taking notes with the devotion of a court stenographer recording testimony for some cosmic tribunal. The partnership was poisonous perfection. What the guests didn't realize until too late was that their confessions came with a price. Dr. Marigny, who had admitted to deliberately misdiagnosing patients to collect insurance money, collapsed during his carriage ride home. The autopsy revealed massive internal bleeding with no apparent cause. His last words, according to his driver, were, "Tell them I paid what I owed." 3 weeks later, Mrs. Broussard suffered a similar fate after confessing to her mercury poisoning. Then Judge Treem found dead in his courthouse chambers with his own confession letter clutched in his rigid fingers. The deaths appeared natural enough to fool the coroner, but the pattern was unmistakable to those who understood the rules of Delphine's deadly game. From the New Orleans Daily Picayune, November 2nd, 1903. The recent spate of sudden deaths among our city's prominent citizens has sparked wild speculation about a curse upon our social elite. Police dismiss such superstition, attributing the tragedies to coincidental natural causes. But Detective Inspector Dubois wasn't satisfied with coincidence. He had noticed that every deceased individual had attended Delphine's dinner parties. More intriguingly, witnesses reported seeing each victim burning papers in their fireplaces during their final days, desperate attempts to destroy evidence of crimes they had confessed at her table. The detective began surveillance of the Royal Street mansion, positioning himself across the square with a clear view of the front entrance. What he observed defied rational explanation. Guests arrived looking healthy and departed looking haggard, as if years had been stolen from their lives during a single evening. But it was Monsieur Morte's departure that truly unsettled him. The man would emerge from the mansion precisely at 1 o'clock in the morning, walking with the measured pace of a funeral procession. But instead of heading toward the main street where carriages waited, he would turn into the narrow alley that ran behind the mansion. Dubois followed once, creeping through shadows with his service revolver drawn. The alley dead-ended at the back wall of St. Louis Cemetery. Monsieur Morte approached the weathered brick barrier, pressed his palm against the stone, and simply walked through it as if the wall were made of mist. Dubois rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating, but found himself staring at solid brick with no trace of passage. Who was this impossible man who moved through walls and drew confessions like a priest hearing final rites? What bargain had Delphine struck to command such supernatural assistance? And why were New Orleans' elite dying one by one, their darkest secrets following them to premature graves? The answers lay hidden in the city's oldest cemetery, where the dead kept more than just bones buried in their crumbling tombs. The wrought iron gate swung open without a sound as the clock tower chimed 12 times across the silent garden district. Fog rolled off the Mississippi River like spilled milk, pooling in the cobblestone streets while the scent of jasmine and decay mingled in the October air, thick enough to taste on the back of your tongue. By midnight, the living guests had always fled, leaving only Delphine to welcome her most important visitor. Mrs. Celeste Thibodeau, who lived in the mansion directly across Royal Street, kept detailed records of what she witnessed from her bedroom window during those autumn nights of 1903. Her diary, discovered after her own mysterious death 6 months later, provides the only reliable account of Delphine's midnight rituals. October 23, 1903. The fog cleared just long enough for me to see him ascending the front steps. Tall, elegant, wearing a coat that seemed to absorb moonlight rather than reflect it. No footprints marked the wet pavement behind him. When he reached the door, Delphine was already waiting with a smile that could freeze blood. The man who called himself Monsieur Morte had appeared at Delphine's first dinner party, claiming to be an old family friend from Paris. He spoke French with an accent that predated the Revolution, used terms of address that had fallen from fashion before Napoleon's time, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of scandals spanning 3 centuries of New Orleans history. More disturbing was his effect on the other guests. Within minutes of his arrival, tongues loosened like wine from broken bottles. Confessions poured forth unbidden. Embezzled funds, poisoned spouses, children sold into slavery despite legal emancipation. Affairs that had destroyed entire bloodlines. Secrets buried so deep their owners had forgotten them surfaced like corpses after a flood. Judge Trem later described the sensation to police investigators. I found myself speaking words I had no intention of saying. It was as if my mouth belonged to someone else, operated by invisible strings. I confessed to taking bribes from the railroad company, to falsifying documents that sent innocent men to Angola prison, to things I swore I would carry to my grave. But Monsieur Morte never spoke of his own past. He simply listened with the patience of stone, occasionally nodding or asking pointed questions that drew forth even more damaging admissions. And always, Delphine sat beside him, taking notes with the devotion of a court stenographer recording testimony for some cosmic tribunal. The partnership was poisonous perfection. What the guests didn't realize until too late was that their confessions came with a price. Dr. Marini, who had admitted to deliberately misdiagnosing patients to collect insurance money, collapsed during his carriage ride home. The autopsy revealed massive internal bleeding with no apparent cause. His last words, according to his driver, were, "Tell them I paid what I owed." 3 weeks later, Mrs. Broussard suffered a similar fate after confessing to her mercury poisoning. Then Judge Trem, found dead in his courthouse chambers with his own confession letter clutched in his rigid fingers. The deaths appeared natural enough to fool the coroner, but the pattern was unmistakable to those who understood the rules of Delphine's deadly game. From the New Orleans Daily Picayune, November 2nd, 1903. The recent spate of sudden deaths among our city's prominent citizens has sparked wild speculation about a curse upon our social elite. Police dismiss such superstition, attributing the tragedies to coincidental natural causes. But Detective Inspector Dubois wasn't satisfied with coincidence. He had noticed that every deceased individual had attended Delphine's dinner parties. More intriguingly, witnesses reported seeing each victim burning papers in their fireplaces during their final days, desperate attempts to destroy evidence of crimes they had confessed at her table. The detective began surveillance of the Royal Street mansion, positioning himself across the square with a clear view of the front entrance. What he observed defied rational explanation. Guests arrived looking healthy and departed looking haggard, as if years had been stolen from their lives during a single evening. But it was Monsieur Morte's departure that truly unsettled him. The man would emerge from the mansion precisely at 1 o'clock in the morning, walking with the measured pace of a funeral procession. But instead of heading toward the main street where carriages waited, he would turn into the narrow alley that ran behind the mansion. Dubois followed once, creeping through shadows with his service revolver drawn. The alley dead-ended at the back wall of St. Louis Cemetery. Monsieur Morte approached the weathered brick barrier, pressed his palm against the stone, and simply walked through it as if the wall were made of mist. Dubois rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating, but found himself staring at solid brick with no trace of passage. Who was this impossible man who moved through walls and drew confessions like a priest hearing final rites? What bargain had Delphine struck to command such supernatural assistance? And why were New Orleans' elite dying one by one, their darkest secrets following them to premature graves? The answers lay hidden in the city's oldest cemetery, where the dead kept more than just bones buried in their crumbling tombs. The rusted cemetery gates groaned like wounded animals as Detective Inspector Dubois pushed them open at dawn. November 4th, 1903. Fog clung to the weathered marble tombs like ghostly shrouds, while the sharp scent of decay and moldering flowers filled his nostrils, each footstep echoing against stone with the hollow sound of walking on graves. What he discovered in St. Louis Cemetery would shatter everything he thought he knew about life and death in New Orleans. The cemetery stretched before him like a miniature city of the dead, its above-ground tombs necessitated by the swampy soil that refused to keep bodies buried. Dubois had come searching for answers about Monsieur Morte's impossible passage through the back wall, but what he found was evidence of something far more sinister than supernatural tricks. The Lalaurie family tomb stood in the cemetery's oldest section, its marble facade blackened with age and carved with symbols that predated Christian burial traditions. Creole crosses intertwined with African spiritual markings and strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from different angles. But it was the tomb's interior that revealed Delphine's true purpose. The heavy stone door stood slightly ajar, impossible since cemetery regulations required all tombs to remain sealed. Dubois drew his revolver and stepped inside, immediately regretting the decision as the temperature dropped 20 degrees and his breath began forming visible clouds in the supernatural chill. Shelves lined the walls where generations of Lalaurie ancestors should have rested in peace. Instead, the tomb contained a workshop of horrors, glass vials filled with unknown substances, leather-bound journals written in multiple languages, and artifacts that belonged in no Christian burial place. Bones arranged in precise patterns covered a makeshift altar, while candles burned with flames that cast no shadows. But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of portraits lining the back wall, paintings of every guest who had attended Delphine's dinner parties. Each face was captured in exquisite detail. But something was wrong with the images. The painted eyes seemed alive, following Dubois as he moved through the tomb, while the mouths appeared to be silently screaming. Death feeds on secrets well told. From Detective Inspector Dubois' personal journal, November 4th, 1903. Found evidence of ritualistic practices within the Lalaurie tomb. Portraits appear to move when observed directly. Cannot explain the sensation of being watched by painted eyes. Requesting transfer to another case immediately. But transfer would not come soon enough. As Dubois examined the portraits more closely, he realized they weren't simply paintings, they were windows. Each image showed its subject in their final moments, captured not by artistic skill, but by some supernatural means that preserved their dying expressions for eternity. Dr. Marigny's portrait showed him clutching his chest in agony. Mrs. Broussard's face was twisted in the distinctive grimace of poison victims. The implications were staggering. Delphine wasn't simply hosting dinner parties, she was collecting souls. Each confession extracted at her table bound the speaker to some infernal contract. Their life force slowly drained until death claimed them. The portraits served as trophies, preserving their final moments for her private gallery of victims. At the tomb's center stood an ornate chair that matched the 13th seat at Delphine's dining table. But this chair showed signs of recent use. The velvet cushions were warm to the touch, and a faint impression remained, as if someone had just vacated it. On the chair's arm lay an open journal written in Delphine's elegant script. November 3rd. Judge Trem's essence proved particularly potent. His lifetime of corruption has seasoned his soul with delicious complexity. Monsieur Morte was pleased with tonight's harvest. Only 3 more required to complete the ritual. The ritual. Dubois felt ice water replace the blood in his veins as he read further. Delphine was not acting alone or even for her own benefit. She was serving something ancient and hungry, something that demanded payment in human souls. The dinner parties were recruitment events, identifying suitable candidates for supernatural harvest. But what was this ritual she sought to complete? And who would be her final 3 victims? The answer came in the journal's final entry. The mayor, the archbishop, and the governor have all accepted invitations for Tuesday's gathering. When their confessions join the others, the gateway will open, and my beloved Armand will return from whatever realm has claimed him. Death is not the end. It is merely the beginning of a far more interesting conversation. Delphine was attempting to resurrect her dead husband, using the collected sins and life force of New Orleans' most powerful citizens as fuel for necromantic magic. But resurrection required equivalent exchange, 12 souls to bridge the gap between life and death. Their combined spiritual energy channeled through Monsieur Morte's supernatural conduit. The detective stuffed the journal into his coat and fled the tomb, his rational mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. Behind him, the portraits seemed to whisper in unison, their painted voices carrying warnings about interference with forces beyond mortal comprehension. As he stumbled through the cemetery gates into the gray November morning, one thought consumed him. How do you stop a widow who dines with death itself, especially when the city's most powerful men have already accepted her final invitation? Time was running out, and Tuesday evening was only 5 days away. Police Captain Eugene Thiraud's office reeked of stale cigars and yesterday's coffee, while rain drummed against the windows like impatient fingers. But the musty scent of old case files couldn't mask the fear that had settled over the New Orleans Police Department, like a burial shroud. Detective Inspector Dubois sat across from his superior, the stolen journal spread between them like evidence of a crime that shouldn't exist. Captain Thiraud had built his career on facts, fingerprints, witness testimony, physical evidence that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. The supernatural confessions contained in Delphine's journal challenged every principle of rational law enforcement. Yet 3 prominent citizens lay dead under suspicious circumstances, and Tuesday's dinner party was less than 48 hours away. "You're asking me to arrest a society widow for communing with the dead," Thiraud said, his weathered fingers drumming against the desk. "The mayor would have my badge, assuming he survives his dinner invitation." Dubois had spent the weekend researching Delphine's background, uncovering a trail of deaths that stretched back decades. Her first husband had died in 1895 of mysterious poisoning. Her second succumbed to sudden heart failure in 1900. Armand Lalaurie was merely the latest in a series of convenient widowhoods that had left Delphine increasingly wealthy and mysteriously youthful, despite her supposed age of 47. Birth records suggested she should be closer to 63. The detective had also discovered references to Monsieur Morte in police files dating back to 1867. The same description, the same elegant dress, the same ageless face appearing at crime scenes across 4 decades. Witnesses described him as a man who collected confessions like others collected stamps, always present when prominent citizens met untimely ends. "He's not human," Dubois said flatly. "Whatever Delphine summoned when her husband died, it's been feeding on New Orleans society for generations. The dinner parties are just the latest method of harvest." Thiraud lit a fresh cigar, buying time to process information that defied everything he understood about criminal behavior. Outside, thunder rolled across the Mississippi River like the laughter of angry gods, while gas lamps flickered in the gathering storm. The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Marcel Boudreau, who burst through the office door without knocking. His face was pale as cemetery marble, his uniform soaked with rain and something darker that stained his sleeve. "Captain, we have a problem at the Marigny mansion," he gasped. "The family is dead. All of them." Looks like they've been that way for weeks, but the neighbors swear they saw lights in the windows last night. Dr. Henri Marigny's body had been found in his study, exactly where his wife claimed to have seen him reading the morning paper just hours earlier. But decomposition suggested he had died days ago, possibly even before his reported attendance at Delphine's most recent dinner party. The family servants told similar stories. They had been serving meals to corpses, taking orders from the dead, living in a house where the boundary between life and death had dissolved completely. Evil wears evening dress to dinner. From the coroner's preliminary report, November 7th, 1903, subjects appear to have died simultaneously despite being found in separate rooms. No obvious cause of death detected. Bodies show advanced decomposition inconsistent with reported timeline of death. Recommend immediate cremation to prevent spread of unknown contagion. But this wasn't contagion, it was magic. Delphine's victims weren't simply dying, they were being transformed into supernatural puppets, their souls harvested while their bodies continued performing the motions of life. The dinner party confessions had bound them to her will, turning them into unwilling participants in her resurrection ritual. How many others were walking around New Orleans as living corpses, their families unaware that their loved ones had already crossed into whatever realm Monsieur Morte represented? Captain Turreau made the decision that would define his career. We raid the mansion tomorrow night during the dinner party. Whatever's happening there ends now, before the mayor and archbishop join the ranks of the walking dead. But raiding a supernatural gathering required more than standard police procedures. Dubois had consulted with Dr. Marie Laveau's successor, the voodoo priestess known only as Maman Brigitte, who provided cryptic warnings about the price of disturbing ancient contracts and souls already promised to darker powers. She had also provided protection, blessed salt to create barriers against supernatural entities, iron bullets forged in cemetery fires, and a vial of holy water that supposedly glowed in the presence of the undead. Whether these folk remedies would prove effective against whatever defended Delphine remained to be seen. As the two police officers prepared for the most unusual raid in New Orleans history, neither realized they were being watched. Across the street from police headquarters, a familiar figure in an elegant coat observed their preparations with patient interest. Monsieur Morte had grown curious about the detective who had disturbed his feeding ground, and curiosity in supernatural beings often proved deadly for mortals. The stage was set for a confrontation between the living and the dead, with the fate of New Orleans' soul hanging in the balance. But in a battle against creatures who had already died once, what weapons could mere mortals hope to wield? Tuesday evening approached like a funeral march, and Delphine was setting the table for her most important dinner party yet. Crystal clinked against bone china as Delphine arranged the final place setting while thunder shook the mansion's ancient timbers, the acrid smell of sulfur and magnolia blossoms drifting through rooms where shadows moved independently of their sources. Tonight, 12 of New Orleans' most powerful men would confess their sins for the last time. Mayor Philippe Berman arrived first at 7:58, his carriage wheels splashing through puddles that reflected no moonlight. Archbishop Michael O'Connell followed minutes later, his ecclesiastical robes rustling with the whispered prayers he'd been muttering since receiving Delphine's invitation. Governor Charles Laurent completed the trinity of power, his political ambitions having finally led him to a table where influence was measured in souls rather than votes. They joined 9 other guests in Delphine's dining room, unaware that 3 of their companions had been dead for over a week. Dr. Marigny sat with perfect posture despite the decomposition hidden beneath his evening clothes. Mrs. Broussard smiled with lips that had lost their warmth days ago. Judge Treme engaged in animated conversation, while maggots fed behind his carefully closed eyes. The living couldn't distinguish between their breathing companions and the walking corpses who attended out of supernatural compulsion rather than social obligation. Death had become an invisible dinner guest, seated at every chair except the 13th. From the personal diary of Archbishop O'Connell, later found in his cathedral office, something unholy permeates that house. The very air tastes of corruption and ancient sins. Yet I find myself unable to leave, drawn by a compulsion stronger than prayer or reason. Delphine moved between her guests like a gracious hostess, ensuring wine glasses remained full and conversation flowed freely. But tonight's vintage was different. Darker, thicker, with an aftertaste that lingered on the tongue like the memory of graves. Those who drank began speaking with unusual candor, their inhibitions dissolving like sugar in bitter coffee. Mayor Berman confessed to embezzling reconstruction funds meant for orphanages destroyed in the yellow fever epidemic. Governor Laurent admitted to selling legislative votes to railroad barons who cared nothing for the communities their tracks destroyed. Even Archbishop O'Connell found himself describing how he had used church donations to silence families whose children had suffered abuse at the hands of his priests. The confessions poured forth like blood from opened veins, each revelation binding the speaker more tightly to Delphine's supernatural web. And through it all, she took meticulous notes in her leather journal, documenting sins that would fuel the resurrection ritual she had spent months preparing. At precisely 11:30, Monsieur Morte made his entrance. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as he glided into the dining room, his coat seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The living guests shivered without understanding why, while the dead ones turned toward him with expressions of terrified recognition. They had met this entity before, in whatever gray realm existed between life and true death. "Gentlemen," Delphine announced, raising her wine glass in a toast that would be their last, "allow me to introduce the guest of honor. He has come to collect what was promised." Outside, Detective Inspector Dubois crouched behind the mansion's garden wall with 6 fellow officers, watching the dining room through tall windows that glowed with unnatural light. Captain Turreau had positioned his men around the building's perimeter, but none of them were prepared for what they witnessed through those windows. As Monsieur Morte began speaking to the dinner guests, their faces changed. Youth drained from their features like water from broken vessels, leaving behind aged husks that resembled their former selves only in clothing and posture. The entity was feeding, consuming their life force as payment for services rendered to Delphine's dark ambitions. "Dear God," whispered Sergeant Boudreau, "they're aging years in minutes." But Dubois noticed something else, something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The dead guests weren't aging, they were decomposing. Dr. Marigny's face collapsed inward as his skull became visible beneath rotting flesh. Mrs. Broussard's elegant dress began sliding off her diminishing frame as her body returned to the dust it should have become weeks ago. The resurrection ritual was beginning, powered by the spiritual energy of New Orleans' corrupt elite. Each confession had been a binding contract, each sin a down payment on Delphine's impossible goal of bringing her husband back from whatever realm had claimed him. Evil collects its debts with interest. Through the dining room windows, they could see Delphine approaching the empty 13th chair where a familiar figure was, beginning to materialize. Armand Lalaurie was returning from the dead, his form solidifying as the life force of 12 powerful men flowed into his spectral body. "We move now," Captain Turreau commanded, "before this gets any worse." But as the police officers prepared to storm the mansion, they failed to notice the fog rolling in from the Mississippi River. fog that moved against the wind and carried voices of the long dead. The dinner party was about to become a battlefield between the living and forces that had never truly died. What weapons could mortal men use against entities that had already conquered death itself? Iron bullets sang through shattered windows as 6 police officers charged into hell disguised as a dinner party, their boots crushing glass that reflected impossible angles while gunpowder smoke mingled with the stench of sulfur and rotting flesh in air thick enough to choke. The raid had become a battle for the very soul of New Orleans. Captain Turode kicked down the front door just as Armand Lalaurie's resurrection reached its climax. The dead man's form had solidified enough to cast shadows, his pale fingers gripping the arms of the 13th chair, while 12 dying souls provided the spiritual fuel for his return to the world of the living. But resurrection was a violation of natural law, and reality itself seemed to rebel against what was happening in that dining room. The mansion's walls began bleeding, not metaphorically, but literally weeping crimson streams that pooled on antique Persian rugs and dripped from crystal chandeliers like tears from wounded angels. The temperature fluctuated wildly, scorching heat near Armand's chair, freezing cold around Monsieur Morte, while pockets of normal air existed only where the blessed salt Dubois carried, created temporary sanctuaries. "Police! Nobody move!" Turreau shouted, though his commands carried little authority in a room where the laws of physics had been suspended by supernatural will. Delphine turned toward the intruders with a smile that belonged on no human face. Her features were shifting, aging and youthing in rapid cycles as the ritual's power flowed through her. Sometimes she appeared as the elegant widow who had charmed New Orleans society. Other moments revealed something ancient and hungry that had worn human form like an ill-fitting costume. "You're too late, detective," she purred, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple speakers occupying the same throat. "The contracts have been signed. The debts are being collected. My beloved Armand returns tonight whether your mortal laws approve or not." Monsieur Morte had not acknowledged the police presence, remaining focused on his grisly harvest. Mayor Berman had aged 30 years in as many minutes, his hair now white as cemetery marble, while his flesh hung loose on bones that showed clearly through translucent skin. Governor Laurent clutched his chest as his heart struggled to pump blood through vessels that were collapsing from supernatural strain. Death collects all debts eventually. Dubois drew his service revolver and aimed at Delphine, but hesitated when he realized the futility of threatening someone who had already died multiple times. The iron bullets blessed by Maman Brigitte might work against supernatural entities, but Delphine straddled the line between human and something else entirely. Archbishop O'Connell provided an unexpected solution. Despite his own rapid aging, he began reciting Latin prayers that filled the air with words of power older than the dark magic consuming his fellow dinner guests. The ancient syllables seemed to create barriers that even Monsieur Morte couldn't cross, forcing the entity to pause in his feeding. "Exorcizamus te, omnis immundus spiritus," the archbishop chanted, his voice growing stronger with each word despite his weakening body. "Omnis satanica potestas, omnis incursio infernalis adversarii." The Latin struck Delphine like physical blows, causing her to stumble backward toward her resurrecting husband. But the ritual had progressed too far to be stopped by prayer alone. Armand's eyes opened for the first time in 6 months, glowing with the collected sins of New Orleans' most corrupt citizens. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of graves. "My darling wife, you have done well." Sergeant Boudreau made the mistake of looking directly into those glowing eyes. His scream cut through the room like a blade, followed by the sickening sound of his body hitting the floor. Whatever Armand had become in death, direct eye contact proved fatal to the living. "Don't look at him!" Dubois shouted, firing his blessed bullets toward the 13th chair. The iron rounds passed through Armand's form without effect. He was still too ethereal, caught between realms until the ritual completed. But the bullets did strike something solid. The collection of portraits lining the dining room walls. Each painted face exploded in sprays of supernatural ichor, releasing the trapped souls Delphine had been collecting for months. The freed spirits swirled through the room like a tornado of vengeance, their combined fury directed at the widow who had enslaved them. The supernatural balance shifted as the portrait's destruction disrupted Delphine's carefully constructed ritual. Armand's form began flickering between solid and spectral, his resurrection wavering as his power source destabilized. Monsieur Morte turned toward the police for the first time, his ageless face showing something that might have been surprise or admiration. "Clever," he said in that accent from another century. "But cleverness alone cannot defeat contracts written in blood and witnessed by forces older than your civilization." He raised one pale hand toward the police officers, and reality bent around his gesture. Dubois felt himself lifted off the ground by invisible forces, his body stretched and twisted as if he were being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously. The pain was indescribable, every nerve ending screaming as supernatural pressure threatened to tear him apart at the molecular level. But salvation came from an unexpected source. The dead dinner guests, who had been shambling through their final moments, began to fight back against their supernatural enslavement. Dr. Marini's corpse wrapped decomposing fingers around Monsieur Morte's throat, while Mrs. Broussard's skeleton clawed at Delphine's elegant gown with bones sharp as razors. The mansion was collapsing around them, both literally and metaphysically, as forces beyond human comprehension warred in its dining room. And through it all, Armand Lalaurie continued his interrupted resurrection, growing more solid with each passing second, despite the chaos threatening to tear apart the very fabric of reality. Who would emerge victorious from this battle between the living and the dead? The chandelier crashed to the floor in a symphony of shattering crystal, as the mansion's foundation cracked beneath the weight of supernatural forces, while plastered dust mixed with blood created a crimson fog that hung in air, thick with the screams of the dying and the howls of the already dead. The battle between worlds had reached its devastating climax. Armand Lalaurie stood fully materialized now, his resurrection complete despite the chaos surrounding him. But the man who had died 6 months earlier was not the man who had returned. Death had changed him, twisted him into something that fed on suffering rather than love. His pale eyes surveyed the carnage with satisfaction as he watched his wife's dinner guests age decades in minutes. "Delphine, my darling," he said, his voice carrying the echo of cemetery winds. "You have exceeded my expectations. These souls will sustain us for centuries." But Detective Inspector Dubois had noticed something that gave him hope. The freed spirits from the destroyed portraits were not simply seeking vengeance. They were reclaiming what had been stolen from them. Each ghostly form that touched one of the dying dinner guests restored a portion of their stolen life force, creating a supernatural tug-of-war between salvation and damnation. Archbishop O'Connell, though aged 20 years by Monsieur Morte's feeding, continued his Latin prayers with weakening but determined voice. The ancient words created visible barriers of golden light that pushed back against the darkness consuming the mansion. Where his prayers touched the supernatural entities, Their forms flickered and wavered like candle flames in a hurricane. "The power of Christ compels you," he shouted, his ecclesiastical training finally proving useful against forces his seminary had never prepared him to face. "Return to whatever hell spawned you." Monsieur Morte laughed, a sound like grinding tombstones. "Your Christ has no power here, priest. These souls were freely given in exchange for earthly pleasures. No divine intervention can break contracts signed willingly in sin." But the entity had underestimated human capacity for redemption. Mayor Berman, despite his rapid aging, found strength to speak. "I renounce my confession. I take back what I said at this cursed table." The words hit Delphine like physical blows. Her supernatural beauty cracked, revealing glimpses of something ancient and decay beneath the elegant facade. "You cannot unsay what has been spoken," she hissed. "The contracts are binding." "Watch me," Governor Laurent gasped, his white hair falling out in clumps as he aged beyond his natural years. "I reject this bargain. My sins are my own to bear, not fuel for your unholy resurrection." One by one, the surviving dinner guests began renouncing their confessions, their words creating cracks in the supernatural foundation Delphine had spent months constructing. Each renunciation weakened the ritual, causing Armand's solid form to flicker between flesh and spirit. Some debts cannot be collected. The mansion itself seemed to rebel against what was happening within its walls. Windows exploded outward, sending glass fragments into the storm that raged beyond. The hardwood floors buckled and split, revealing earth that bled like wounded flesh. Even the gas lamps began burning with flames that cast no light, only darkness that seemed to devour illumination itself. Captain Turode rallied his remaining officers for one final assault. 3 men were down, Sergeant Boudreau dead from looking into Armand's eyes, 2 others unconscious from supernatural attacks. But the survivors pressed forward with iron bullets and blessed salt, creating protective barriers against entities that shouldn't exist. Dubois reached Delphine just as her human disguise finally collapsed completely. What stood before him was something that might have once been a woman, but centuries of supernatural bargains had transformed her into a creature of living shadow and malevolent will. Her true age was impossible to determine, her features shifting between youth and ancient decay with each heartbeat. "You don't understand," she pleaded as he pressed his service revolver against what passed for her temple. "Armand and I transcend death itself. We are eternal lovers, bound by forces stronger than your mortal laws." "Then join him in whatever realm he came from," Dubois replied, pulling the trigger. The blessed iron bullet passed through her skull like it was made of mist, but instead of killing her, it seemed to set her free. Her scream of agony transformed into something resembling relief as her supernatural bindings dissolved. For just a moment, she appeared as she truly was, a woman who had loved her husband so desperately that she had damned herself to bring him back. With Delphine's death, the resurrection ritual collapsed. Armand's form began dissolving like smoke in wind, his angry howls filling the air as he was pulled back toward whatever realm had claimed him. Monsieur Morte made no attempt to save his supernatural partner, simply observing the proceedings with the detached interest of a scholar watching an interesting experiment fail. "This round belongs to the living," he said to Dubois with something resembling respect. "But death is patient, detective. We have all eternity to try again." The entity walked toward the mansion's ruined wall and passed through it like mist, leaving behind only the acrid smell of sulfur and the echo of footsteps that sounded like shovels striking coffin wood. The surviving dinner guests would recover most of their stolen years, though they would carry the memory of their supernatural ordeal until their natural deaths decades later. The mansion on Royal Street was condemned and demolished, its haunted foundations salted and blessed by priests from 3 different faiths. But in the weeks that followed, Detective Inspector Dubois began noticing familiar patterns in other cities across the South. Mysterious dinner parties, unexplained deaths among the wealthy and powerful, reports of an elegant man who collected confessions like others collected stamps. Monsieur Morte had simply moved his hunting grounds, and somewhere else, another desperate widow might be setting a table for 13. The New Orleans Police Department filed their official report on November 15, 1903, listing the incident as a gas explosion caused by faulty mansion wiring. While the smell of sulfur and secrets lingered in the French Quarter air, thick enough to taste on curious tongues that sought flavors better left unexplored. But those who survived the dinner party of the damned knew the truth could never be buried in bureaucratic paperwork. Detective Inspector Dubois spent the remainder of his career tracking similar incidents across the American South. His private files, discovered after his death in 1927, contain newspaper clippings from Atlanta, Charleston, and Richmond, all reporting mysterious deaths among social elites following elaborate dinner parties hosted by recently widowed women. The pattern was always the same: confessions extracted, souls harvested, resurrection attempts that left behind only empty mansions and aging corpses. The network was vast, ancient, and patient. From Dubois' personal correspondence, dated March 3, 1904, Monsieur Morte is not one entity but a title, passed down through generations of supernatural collectors. Each serves the same master, death itself, which grows hungry for the souls that escape natural claiming. The dinner parties are merely the latest method of harvest in a system that predates written history. Mayor Berman survived his supernatural ordeal, but resigned from office within the month, claiming health concerns that his doctors couldn't identify or treat. He lived another 30 years, but never again ate food prepared by hands he hadn't watched personally. Governor Laurent spent his remaining days funding orphanages and hospitals, desperately trying to balance the scales of cosmic justice that had nearly claimed his soul. Archbishop O'Connell became obsessed with documenting supernatural encounters, filling the cathedral archives with accounts that would be dismissed as fiction by future scholars. His final journal entry, written the night before his natural death in 1931, contained a chilling warning. The feast never truly ends. It simply moves to new tables, served by new hands, consumed by souls who believe themselves too powerful to pay the ultimate price. But what happened to the mansion's remains proved most disturbing of all. The lot where 2140 Royal Street once stood remained empty for decades, despite its prime location in the Garden District. Buyers would make offers, sign contracts, then mysteriously withdraw before closing. Construction crews reported tools that moved on their own, foundation concrete that refused to set, and the persistent sound of dinner conversation drifting from empty air. Local children claimed they could see lights in windows that no longer existed, while dogs refused to walk past the vacant lot after sunset. The city eventually turned the space into a small park, but even that failed to dispel whatever supernatural residue lingered in the soil where Delphine had practiced her dark arts. In 1956, urban developers attempted to build a restaurant on the site. The foundation was laid, walls erected, kitchen equipment installed. But on opening night, the first customers reported hearing the clink of crystal glasses and the murmur of confession being extracted from unwilling throats. The restaurant closed within a week, its owners claiming bankruptcy rather than explaining what they had witnessed in their dining room after midnight. The lot stands empty today. 21st century New Orleans treats the Lalaurie dinner party as folklore, a spooky story to entertain tourists on ghost tours that wind through the French Quarter. But police records show a curious pattern. Every few years, someone attempts to purchase the vacant lot with plans to honor the victims by hosting memorial dinners. These would-be developers always withdraw their offers after receiving elegant invitations written in flowing script, inviting them to join the eternal feast where hunger is forever satisfied. The invitations are never signed, but witnesses describe the handwriting as impossibly perfect, as if written by hands that have had centuries to practice their craft. And sometimes, on humid August nights when the Mississippi fog rolls through the Garden District, residents report seeing candlelight flickering in windows that face the empty lot, as if someone is still setting the table for guests who promised to attend but have yet to arrive. The investigation into supernatural dinner parties continues in cities across America, following patterns that suggest Monsieur Morte's network has adapted to modern times. Recent reports describe email invitations that cannot be deleted, catered events where servers wear masks to hide faces that don't photograph properly, and exclusive restaurants where the menu changes based on each diner's deepest secrets. Death has learned to use new silverware, but the feast remains the same. Even now, in some elegant dining room where crystal catches candlelight like captured fireflies, another desperate soul might be arranging place settings for guests who will pay far more than they expect for the privilege of confession. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.